Okay. So today I'm going to demonstrate another pinch pot project. Last time you'll see it in this on the YouTube here. You'll be able to find me doing a pumpkin. This is the springtime now, so my class is going to be making eggs. So we're going to start out with a 2-pound ball of clay. So my students will be weighing out 2 pounds of clay, and then they're going to start out by cutting that relatively in half. It doesn't need to be exactly in half, but about half of the ball of clay. Use a wire tool for that. You could also probably just ripped it in half, but basically 2 balls of clay. Those are not actually very good, not very equal. So as I pointed out earlier, you don't have to use a wire tool. Take a moment to kind of pound them into ball shapes of about equal size. So you do want to try to avoid getting air in there in general, so don't be too careless in terms of what you do there. But 2 balls of clay, I think this one's still a little smaller, but that doesn't bother me that much. They're about the same size. So step 1 when making a pinch pot is to make a ball of clay that's pretty round. This one is about the size of a baseball. Should be about 1 pound of clay, and it is about 1 pound of clay. At this moment, I always think of the nursery rhyme, Little Jack Horner sat in a corner eating a Christmas pie. He stuck in his thumb, pulled out a plum, and oh, what a good boy am I. Because I'm going to basically take my thumb and stick it right down in the middle. Try to make sure that I'm staying centered as I do that. As I push down to the point where I'm leaving about 1/2 inch on the other side. So on the inside, it's about 1/2 inch from the other side. I don't want to push all the way through. I want to have a nice about 1/2 inch from that other side, so my fingers are about 1/2 inch away from each other. I'm going to put this down in my hand here, and I'm going to squeeze at the tip of my finger right here. So I'm thinning out the wall of this pot. This is basically a pot now, right? It's got an inside, it's got an outside. It's basically just a very thick, fat pot right now. And I'm going to thin it out. I'm going to make the walls skinnier and skinnier. But right now, I'm not thinning it out here. I'm thinning it out right down here. And I'm trying to make it even as I rotate it around. I want to go around and make it even so it's all, so now this whole area down here is kind of 1/2 inch or less. I probably want to be 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch. Now I'm working up, you'll see that I'm no longer working here, I'm now working here. And I'm going to just keep going around and around and around. I'm not squeezing real hard each time, I'm just going a little bit at a time, kind of squeezing it a little bit until it feels even all the way around. And as it feels even and about the right thickness, down to about here now, I'm going to start working my way out towards the edge. You can see now I've gone all the way from here to here. I keep going around as I set it on my hand every time. Kind of come around, down, 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 thinning it out, thinning it out, thinning it out. Trying to keep it even. Not trying to be overly crazy about every little, making sure that's perfect and so forth. I'm just trying to make it even. Now at this point, if I tried to reach that bottom, I couldn't reach it because my fingers aren't long enough, which is why you need to deal with this area first and then work your way this way, because at some point you're not gonna be able to reach that bottom. So this is why I'm not gonna deal with the edge and then try to get back to the bottom, because I just won't be able to get there. Okay. So each time I pull, I'm kind of pulling with my outside fingers and pushing with my thumb. I'm kind of doing that, and it's hard to see from the video angle. I'm pulling with these fingers and pushing with these fingers as I'm kind of thinning it out. Okay, so now I've got the whole thing kind of created as this kind of general kind of pinch pot shape. The top is not perfectly flat right now. And I'm going to, this is the bottom of my egg is what this is going to be. So now I'm going to take a moment to try to turn this into the bottom half of an egg. An egg is not the same on the bottom. The bottom of it's rounder, the top of it's more conical. So I'm going to take a moment to make the top flat. I'm going to take a moment to kind of look at it and try to make sure that it is round and it's the general kind of bottom of an egg shape. My egg is gonna sit, when I'm done, I want it to sit on a counter like that. So I'm not actually trying to make it perfectly round on the bottom. I'm trying to put a flat spot on the bottom. I'm trying to think of this as the bottom half of an egg. Now, you're gonna work slower than I am right now. I've been doing this for about 20 years now. 23 years now. 1997. So that's probably a good thing, because I'm going to let this thing dry out a little bit. You might very well find that you do just the one side and then you let this thing dry while you work on the other side. You don't want to let this thing dry out too much. You want to make sure that this piece remain, if it starts changing, like if you leave it for multiple days, it's going to become too dry to put the top on, because we're going to make the top, we're going to attach the two of them. But for right now today, without moving the camera over, I'm going to take this over to a student over there that you're not going to get on camera, and she's going to take a heat gun and going to dry this a little bit while I'm working on the other thing. So your clay shouldn't dry this fast unless you're working during the summer and you take it outside, put it on your deck while you work for 45 minutes. It'll probably stiffen up. But the next time I see this, it's going to be stiffer. It's going to be much harder for me to try to change the form. So at this point, I'm going to try to make sure it's right where I want it to be in terms of the shape. And I'm going to bring this over to the student over here. You wait right there. There you go. Sorry about the noise. That's the sound of a heat gun. It's very much like a hairdryer, but it's hot enough that it's intended to melt paint. So now I have the second object, and I'm going to do the same thing. But I'm going to talk a little bit less. Now this one, because of the shape, I'm going to try to pull more this direction and less, and try to not let it get too wide, because I want this to be kind of a taller form, because it's the other side of the egg. I had a moment right there where I thought, okay, I'm not going to be able to reach this bottom anymore in a moment, so I better make sure that I'm happy with it. Trying to make sure it's even, not too thin in any spot, before I get too far away from the bottom. Remember, thumb's kind of pushing down, this is kind of pushing in as I kind of stretch it out. I'm working a little faster than you guys would be, most likely. This is causing my fingers to hurt. I also want to make sure that this doesn't get too wide for the work that I've already done. So I need to be careful that if I make this thing wide, it's not going to fit the other piece, which I'm going to go grab in a moment, because I'm going to need to make sure they're about the same. So I've kind of created this form here. I'll be back in a second. You stay right there. Oh, it's already getting stiffer. It would have been smart for me to do this. Although typically you're going to have the piece sitting there on your table. This is going to allow me to try to make sure this is fitting the right size. So now I have an idea of how big that other thing is. I'm needing to pull this clay, thin it out more, because the shape I want to get and the size I want to get. I'm actually a little worried that for the amount of clay that I have, made that bottom half too wide. Although I'm getting there. I want this half to be taller than the first half was. And pretty close to the right size though. I'm gonna go ahead and go over and switch out these two pieces now. I'll go grab my other piece back. And go ahead and lift that pot up. Okay, this is still, she's only been drying it for a few minutes. It's definitely a little stiffer than it was last time. But it's still soft enough that I can move it around actually. But if you left your pot out for the day before, it's probably not going to be this forgiving. If you left this sitting out on your deck or out in the sun for long, it's probably not going to be as movable as this. You'll remember that I was talking about how I thought this was a little wide. Because I still have a moment, because I still have some movement in here, I'm trying to bring this in a little bit, try to make it a little smaller. Which I'm sure that I'm going to be able to do with the other piece in a moment when I ask her for it. But because I've had this thing dried out a little bit, it's definitely strong enough that I'm going to be able to build on top of it. Now while she continues to dry that other piece, I'm going to take a moment to talk about the next step. So once you have these two pieces together and you've had a chance to dry them out a little bit, they're pretty stable in terms of their shape. And you've got them, most likely in my class, it's going to be the next day. These things are likely to be covered in plastic so that they dry out a little bit, but they're not too much dry. You want to have two good pieces of clay that are not dry, but still tough enough to hold their form. It's called leather hard. We're going to scratch up these two surfaces really well. I'm using a fork because I don't want to be careful with this. I want to really rough it up pretty good. Take a moment to go turn that pot over because I wanted to dry the lip. Give me a second. So with the pot over there, I turned it over because I wanted her to dry this lip a little bit. Because of the timing of this, I'm going to need to go grab that in a couple seconds here, and I don't think it's going to be as dry as I want. But when you have something that's leather hard, meaning it's dry enough that if you tried to reshape the whole thing, it would crack rather than form. I can form this thing pretty well right now. It's not really leather hard. It's definitely a little drier than it was originally, but it's not what I'd call leather hard. If you work on this, my students who do work like this tomorrow and then come back on Friday, it's definitely going to be what's called leather hard, unless they cover it really well. If you cover something really well with plastic, like completely covered, then it's probably going to be exactly the same as it is the next day, or very close to. It's barely going to dry out at all. Now this is left by the other art teacher on my campus. He's going to call this slip, but it's not technically slip. Slip is actually liquefied clay. It's got something called a deflocculant in it that pushes the particles away from each other, so it's not actually extra watery. But a lot of potters just kind of use watered down clay like this. But it's the equivalent of slip. Basically what I'm doing is imagine that this clay has dried out a bit, and this is kind of like hard clay. I'm basically softening up this edge so that when I take that other piece and attach it, any second, I'll come get it in a moment here, then it gives it a chance to really kind of get together. I'll be back in a second. Oh, look at that, you melted mine. It's all right. Well, you can see how hot that the hairdryer or the heat gun is. It actually melted this container because this was straight a moment ago. I put it in here because I didn't want it to flat. I don't want a flat spot on the bottom here, so I didn't want to pop it down like that. I wanted to keep it round. Well, we're in pretty good shape. It's kind of a short, fat, looks more like a dinosaur egg. But I'm going to do the same thing. Okay, you can come on over here if you'd like to watch. I'm going to. Oh, actually, it's pretty. It did a very good job. As obviously, this is a very hot gun, heat gun. This is drier than I thought it would be, considering how little time she had working on it. You could use a hairdryer at home if you wanted to. but you know, it's not likely to work as efficiently as this did. Okay, you really want to make sure that when you combine two pieces of clay that have dried out at all, that you do a really good job of really getting these two surfaces together. So I'm going to do a lot to make sure these things are attached, because later on when you put this thing in the kiln, which is a ceramic oven, and you fire this thing, meaning you bring it up to temperature, this thing's gonna, the first time I put it in the kiln, it's gonna go to around 1860 degrees. This is where it's likely to crack. Where you took two pieces of clay and you put them together, this is where it's likely to crack. So I'm creating a really kind of rough, kind of muddy kind of area on there, on both sides. And I'm gonna put these things together. I'm gonna make sure they line up really well with each other. If I push too hard down on here, it's probably gonna deform the bottom. So I'm gonna hold on to this thing, and I'm really going to put effort into making sure these things get really lined up nicely and really pushed into each other, just to start. This is not enough. It's not enough to just kind of push these things together and call it a day, because I really want you to make sure that these things do not come apart. So now that I've done a pretty good job of getting these things lined up and putting some real pressure against them, I scored the surface really well. I applied slip or water, if that's what you need to do, to that surface to get them wet, and I'm really kind of pushing those things together. And now I'm going to take a tool. The end of this spoon is going to work really well. I could probably also use this thing right here, but I like the end of this fork right now. And I'm going to take and I'm going to push get up in here close. I'm taking the clay from this side and I'm pushing it down into this side. It's called welding. I'm going to weld these things together, going this direction. I'm pushing that clay down into that surface there. I'm going to go all the way around this. Something we'll be doing later on in this semester more when we're talking about slab construction. If you watch my slab construction video, which is also here on YouTube, you'll see that I do something very similar to this as well. I'm going to push that down into that thing, which I could potentially be doing more carefully, but it's actually fine. Then I'm going to go back the other direction. I'm going to pull that bottom up into the top, basically intermingling these two clay bodies, or these two clay objects, into each other really well. You want to just assume that these things are going to want to come apart right there. And if you don't do this well, you're going to end up regretting. You're going to regret it. Now I need to find something that I should have grabbed earlier, but I do remember seeing one up over here. This is a good one. This is a metal rib. Works nicely for this purpose. So now my goal is, I feel like those things are really well combined. So I'm going to try to clean this thing up. That's the bottom of my egg. I'm going to take a moment to make sure the whole thing is kind of the right size. I can easily grab some extra clay. If I have something like there's a little spot right there that bothers me, I don't have to smooth it over. I can always, like especially when we're talking, like if you watch the other video for the slab construction, quite often that process that I was just doing where I was welding will end up leaving a kind of a groove. And I will take a roll of this stuff. I will take this, I'll roll it out and I'll fill in that little groove. Right now I don't really feel like I have that much of a groove, so I don't really feel like I'm going to just run a coil around it. I'm just going to go around the whole thing, and if there's a spot where I think I don't want to do too much there, I don't want to clean that up by pushing it away, you can fill it in. You can find different ways to kind of fill this in. Okay. I don't want to make this video too ridiculously long, so we're going to turn this into a two-part video. Step one is basically just creating the egg form, a closed egg form, because that's what my students are going to be doing. So my goal is to, before I let this thing sit for a day, I want to make sure that I've done a good job of of making these two different forms, letting them dry out a little bit so they become, I don't want you to be working with, I don't want you two kind of amorphous kind of soft balls of clay and then put them together and then try to turn it into an egg. I want you to create the top egg form, the bottom egg form, let them stiffen up a little bit and put them together and see that they fit together nicely, and then attach them really well, and then clean them up pretty well, and then let them dry for a little bit, because we're then going to give you a couple options in my class, at least in terms of what we do from here moving forward. I'm thinking that I'm going to ask my students to, although this is not really set in stone, although the next video it'll be set in stone by then, I'm thinking about having them do some sort of a jagged kind of cut line, so you end up with very much like a pumpkin. When you cut out the top, you have a piece that fits into it perfectly, so that you end up with a lidded container for you to put for them to put things in that has a kind of a lid that fits perfectly on there. I think that's what we're going to go with in this class, but you will find out in the next video. Thank you very much for paying attention.